From the book Snow Angels by Harriet Loveday, Finding Love Under the Christmas Tree. Keri knocked on her mum's front door. She was just trying to focus on holding it together. She could hear her mum's footsteps across the slate floor in the little cottage. Then reaching the door, she heard her as she fiddled with the key in the lock. Keri turned around to look at the sleepy village in the morning light, watching the last cold wisps of night retreating behind hedges and parked cars. Frost stiffened the grass in the front garden and encapsulated the spider's webs on the rose bushes, which ran along the stone wall in front of her mum's cottage. Pushing her glasses back up her nose, tucking a stray lock of black hair behind her ear and hugging her check coat tight around her, Keri heard her mum open the door. "Oh, Mum," Keri cried, and fell into her mum's arms, which were soft, warm and comforting. Her mum was still in her dressing gown, and her hair was a little dishevelled from sleep. She still had the same warmth and smell of sleep as she wrapped her arms tight around her daughter and said, "Oh, love, come on in out of the cold." Keri left her hastily packed bags in the car. She dropped her handbag by the door, and her mum ushered her through to the living room, where they sat on the sofa next to the happily flashing Christmas tree. Safe in her mother's arms, Keri cried and cried. After Keri had cried her heart out and her mum had shushed her and soothed her, her mum suggested a cup of tea. Keri nodded in agreement. While her mum left for the kitchen to make tea, Keri got up and looked at her appearance in the mirror. Her black, pixie-cropped hair held neatly to her head. Her heavy glasses and pleasant open face looked just the same as always, but her grey eyes were puffy and red with crying. She had cried a lot the last 2 days. Keri knew they'd had problems, but she just didn't understand why it had to come to a head at Christmas. She was also angry that once again he'd let his mum stomp all over them. It wasn't that her mother-in-law was the main problem, but she certainly didn't help, and Matt prioritising his mother's wants and wishes over her was the last straw. She just wished it didn't have to be this way. She did love him, but she couldn't take it anymore. Keri looked sadly down at her hand to where her wedding ring had sat just yesterday. Is this who she was, the divorcee? Keri's mum came back into the living room with 2 cups of tea, and Keri joined her on the sofa. As she sipped her tea, she could feel her hurt and upset bubbling up inside her again. Hot tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, Mum, why did he do it? Why did he let us stomp all over us?" Keri said. Her mum shook her head and set her mouth to a grim line. "I don't know, love," she said. "It was when she went house hunting for you behind your back that I really started to understand how controlling she was." Her mum shook her head again. It was comforting for Keri to know that she wasn't imagining it, that this wasn't right. Matt had tried to gaslight her, to tell her it was in her head, but it wasn't right. He said that living between her and his mother was like a cancer growing between them. He said, what upset Keri the most was that she tried so hard because she loved him. Fresh hot tears welled up in her eyes and spilled over. "Oh, Mum, I do still love him. How can I be here?" "Shh." Her mum rocked her baby girl in her arms. "Shh, there. As it was Boxing Day, her mum wanted to go to church, so Keri was left alone in the cottage to start preparing lunch. It felt good to be active and not crying. It took her mind off things. Her brother, Paul, his wife, and her niece would be over for lunch too. Keri was glad to see Paul, but she felt like such a failure. She was divorcing the man she loved because she was downright miserable and she just couldn't take the pain anymore. Was she insane? No messages from Matt on her phone. No missed calls. Keri tried to keep busy peeling potatoes and chopping carrots to go with the roast turkey. At least her family understood. Her mum returned from church an hour before her brother and his family arrived and helped with the last of the cooking. Keri's niece was delighted to see her, and her sister-in-law was understanding and kind. Keri tried to be honest about everything that had happened, tried not to cry, and was just grateful that at least she had somewhere to go. The family spent the afternoon playing board games and watching Christmas films on the TV. Paul came back from outside after smoking a rollie. "Hey sis," he said to Keri, "you fancy coming to the pub for a drink?" Keri was about to say yes when both her sister-in-law and her mum chimed in saying they wanted to come too. Everyone looked at Keri's 8-year-old niece watching cartoons, completely oblivious. Keri felt guilty, and she couldn't exactly expect her mum to babysit when she just imposed herself on her at short notice, and she understood why her sister-in-law wanted to go. Keri broke the stalemate by offering to stay. Besides, she wasn't exactly looking pretty at the moment with her puffy face and red eyes. Snuggling up with her niece on the sofa and wrapping a fleecy blanket around them, Keri and her niece tucked into the Lindt chocolates while the grown-ups went to the pub. Keri's family returned about an hour later, merry from the sherry and bubbling with gossip. "Did you have a nice time?" Keri asked from her cosy spot on the sofa. Her mum replied, "Oh, it was great. Everyone in the village seems to have had a good Christmas. The bell ringers were out too. I think they're heading down to the church later." Her mum hung up her coat. "Oh, and Jackie from up the road has left her husband," she blurted out. Trying to cover her insensitivity, she gave Keri a quick kiss on the head, saying, "See, it's not just you that has the grotty husband." Keri smiled wanly. She hadn't heard from Matt, but that was how he handled every conflict: stonewalling, withdrawal, silence, because he was always the victim, because he was in pain, she reasoned, because by leaving she had caused him pain. Perhaps it was better to hurt herself than hurt him. Keri mustered her courage to her and replied, "Thanks, Mum. Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only one. No fun, though." Her mum continued to gossip. "Well, it's been on the cards for a while. Don't you remember that trouble over their son's primary school teacher? He definitely had an affair. She's well rid." Keri sighed. She was just another number in the cesspool of failed marriages and I told you so's. This wasn't what she'd planned for her life. Paul said, "Oh, and Dan was at the pub. He was asking after you." Keri was surprised. "Dan? How is he?" Dan had had a crush on Keri pretty much all of their teenage years. Dan liked bikes and engines. He now worked on tractor repairs. He had his own business. He used to look at Keri like she was the sun. But he hadn't been good enough. Yes, he was extraordinarily good-looking, tall, muscly, warm blue eyes, curly brown hair. But he'd never wanted to go anywhere or be anything. He'd been content to stay here, and Keri had wanted more. He'd taken her on a date once, as a dare. Nothing had come of it. Keri hadn't really been that interested. She'd always been fond of Dan, though. Coming back here and living a mundane life wasn't what she'd wanted. It wasn't what she'd planned. However, on reflection, what she'd been chasing hadn't exactly turned out to be her happy ever after, had it? Paul replied, "Yeah, all right. His business is doing well. Tractors always need fixing. When I said you were here, he talked about popping by." There was an awkward silence. Paul had obviously said a bit more than that, but he didn't want to embarrass his sister. Plus, it wasn't as if this was the first time she'd left her husband. Keri knew she wasn't happy. Her friends and family knew she wasn't happy, and they were all concerned. Keri was lucky to have people in her life that cared about her. She said, "Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to see him." Paul smiled. "That's what I said." Paul tweaked his daughter's ponytail. "Right, young lady, time to go home." Keri's niece protested, but it was of no use. In a flap of carrier bags and boxes of cold turkey to take home, Keri's brother and his family left. Keri spent the rest of the evening sat on the sofa in front of the fire, watching Christmas films and sharing a bottle of red wine with her mum. Sometimes healing happens through the simple things. The next morning, Keri had a slow start. She had stopped crying at the drop of a hat, but she wasn't exactly energetic, so it was no surprise that when Dan came around to visit mid-morning, Keri was still in her heart-pattern pyjamas and dressing gown. Dan's familiar face popped around the living room door. "Hey, Keri, you all right?" he asked in his cheerful way. Same warm blue eyes and curly brown hair, same smile. Keri looked up and gave an upside-down smile. "Not really," she sighed. "But I've been here before, right?" "Oh, lass, don't be so hard on yourself," said Dan. Keri's mum interjected, "Tea for everyone?" "Thanks, Helen," Dan replied. "Love a cuppa." Keri's mum discreetly popped the teas on the coffee table and busied herself in the kitchen while Dan and Keri chatted by the flickering Christmas tree. Dan listened quietly without judgment while Keri talked it out. In a few places he allowed himself a shake of the head, but that was about it. When Keri finished, he summed it up with, "I understand you trying to be fair and look at it from all sides, but you don't sound very happy to me, and whichever way you slice it, that's the truth." Keri tried to keep the tears down, but Dan had pretty much nailed it. Keri tried to reply, I'm not happy," and burst into tears. "Ah, lass," said Dan. With sad eyes, he sat next to her on the sofa, put his arms around her and said, "Hey, it's all right, home now, eh?" Keri felt warm and safe being held by Dan. One of the hallmarks of her marriage was that she'd felt unprotected, vulnerable, unsafe all the time. Is this how it's supposed to be? Are you supposed to feel safe in relationships, or is it your fault if you don't? Dan let her have her cry. When her tears subsided, he passed her a tea and suggested, "Why don't you come with me to the pub tonight to play some pool and forget about all of this?" Keri nodded sadly. She just wanted to feel normal again. Keri felt a bit nervous going out to the pub. She hadn't really thought about nice clothes to go out in, so she just wore her best jeans and boots with a chunky jumper and her check coat. It was good enough. Dan dropped by the cottage and walked up the road to the pub with her. The evening was cold, but it was fine, and despite the village streetlights, they could still see the moon and the stars. Keri had forgotten how nice it was to be home. She felt safe here. Their conversation soon turned to when they were kids, riding bikes, making dens, and when they got older, making campfires and underage drinking. By the time they got to the pub, Keri was almost laughing. Keri knew most of the people in the pub, and they certainly remembered her. For the first 20 minutes, she was probed with questions. How was her job? Where was she living now? Was she back for long? Everybody avoided talking about Matt, which meant word had got around and they all knew. It didn't bother Keri too much because she had a choice. She could stay unhappy or she could be divorced and free. 2 days ago, she'd chosen the latter. This was the start of a new life and a new path. She just had to be brave and walk it. Dan was a gentleman and insisted on buying the drinks. He also secretly let her win the first 2 games of pool and said she still had a great aim with the cue. She didn't. The pub music list was entirely Christmas songs, and there was a rainbow-coloured Christmas tree dancing merrily in the corner. Dan was a gentleman and insisted on buying the drinks. He also secretly let her win the first 2 games of pool and said she had a great aim with the cue. She didn't. The pub music list was entirely Christmas songs, and there was a rainbow-coloured Christmas tree dancing merrily in the corner. Keri found herself unwinding, relaxing, and starting to feel happy. Dan walked Keri home and suggested that tomorrow they go for a walk up on the moors. Perhaps it was the wine, perhaps it was the Christmas spirit, perhaps it that she was starting to feel less unhappy, but much to Keri's surprise, she said, "Yes." Dan picked Keri up at 10 the next morning. He was in his work van and had thoughtfully picked up some snacks for them to eat on the drive. He was also keen to stop at a pub for lunch too. Keri just tried to let go and go with the flow. The morning was bright and crisp, not too cold. Keri hadn't bought any rain gear with her or walking boots, but she'd borrowed her mum's wellies and her coat was warm enough. Driving up over the moors was spectacular. Keri had forgotten how beautiful it was. No wonder people wanted to live here and house prices were so high. Keri looked around Dan's van. How did he afford it? To live in this part of the world doing the job he was doing? Perhaps Dan hadn't got it wrong. He was doing a job he loved in a beautiful part of the world, surrounded by family and friends. Perhaps it was Keri, chasing impossible dreams of others' ideals that had missed the point entirely. What was she doing with her life? The moors stretched out before them as far as the eye could see. They were up high, and in places grey rocks broke through the scrubby green and brown grass. Twisted hawthorns and gorse bushes held themselves firm against the winter weather, waiting for the spring to flower again. There were little streams to jump and small grey stone bridges built centuries ago. It was as if this was a landscape to last all time. The air was fresh and the sky was endless. Keri drew in the pure air and exhaled all her hurt and sorrow. It was lovely walking with Dan. He was so comfortable to be around. He was easy company. Dan still looked at Keri with his warm blue eyes in the same way he'd always done, like she was sunshine. She didn't feel anything special, though. As they walked over the rocky, scrubby ground, he pointed out landmarks of interest and unusual plants or birds. They walked to a high point, and looking out at the vistas all around, Dan said, "Do you remember when I took you on that date?" Keri felt a bit awkward, but she owed Dan her honesty. He'd always been honest with her. "Yes, I do," she replied. "I was completely in love with you back then." He laughed at himself and threw a small stone into the air, watching it eventually hit the side of the hill and bounce down. "I think I knew that," Keri replied. "But you weren't in love with me?" he asked. It wasn't what I wanted back then. I wanted to leave, to see the world, Keri said. Is that what you want now? No, I don't want to hurt anymore. I'd like to feel safe and happy. Keri looked at her feet. I want to come home. Dan turned to her with tender eyes, and she raised her teary ones to his as he said, Don't want you to ever feel unhappy. Leaning down, he softly kissed her. Keri and Dan didn't talk about the kiss on the way home. Technically, she was still married, and she'd only left her husband a few days ago. Although she defended herself, it wasn't the first time she'd left. Dan pulled up his van in front of Keri's mum's house. She could see the Christmas tree flashing through the living room window as dusk started to settle. Dan turned the engine off, and they sat in silence for a few moments. Finally, Dan spoke. I really enjoyed today, Keri, the walk on the moors, the pub lunch. I always feel good when I'm around you. Keri replied, I had a nice time too, Dan. He turned to her in the half-light and asked, Honestly, Keri, how do you feel when you're around me? Keri gulped. She was trying to be brave and name her feelings. Honestly, when I'm with you, Dan, I feel safe and I feel loved, like I'm standing in the sun. Dan smiled. That's about right then. He took her hand and asked, Come have dinner with me tomorrow. Keri looked up at his imploring eyes. Yes, she replied. Keri had only bought one dress in her hasty packing, and she didn't want to wear it as she didn't want her mum to think one thing or another. Not that it probably made a difference, because her mum had already raised an eyebrow at her when she said she was having tea at Dan's house tonight. To her mum's credit, she didn't say anything and just let her daughter be. Besides, her mum didn't want to add fuel to the neighbours' gossip. Just a meal, nothing to see here. Dan lived in a tiny little cottage squeezed in amongst other tiny little cottages in a terraced row at the top of the village, not far from the pub. Every room had steps up and down to it. Surprisingly, the living room was able to take 2 small sofas and a TV with a stand. A small Christmas tree flashed rainbow-coloured fairy lights on the windowsill. It was amazing how he fitted it all in. Off the living room there was a little galley kitchen with a small dining area on the other side of the breakfast bar. There was also a downstairs bathroom with a shower head over the bath. Some narrow, steep, enclosed stairs led upstairs to 2 bedrooms, 1 double, and a tiny study. It was almost like a little cottage hobbit house. Dan was cooking curry, one of Keri's favourite meals. He'd remembered. Like the perfect host, he had old-school music from their youth playing on the speakers and a bottle of red wine airing on the table. He insisted she sit down while he finished the cooking. The meal was delicious. Dan had made everything from scratch. Keri couldn't help but be impressed and completely forgave him that the pudding was shop-bought ice cream. Dan took the wine bottle with them as they moved through to the living room. They talked and talked. Keri felt so comfortable. She felt as if she could be honest with him and tell him everything. It was a strange feeling to be listened to, taken seriously, not judged, and to feel safe. Keri hadn't felt safe in a long time. Dan grabbed another bottle of red wine as they reminisced about the old days and funny things that had happened when they were growing up. How Keri's brother Paul had been chased by a bull. When Dan had found some keys left in a tractor and he decided to have a go at driving it. Keri couldn't help but laugh. Dan smiled at her and said, There she is. There's my Keri back again. Their eyes locked together. It was as if time had stopped and taken a breath. Leaning forward, Dan kissed Keri softly on the lips. She felt like she was falling into a soft, comfy bed. Keri felt warm and she felt loved. She felt safe. Dan broke the kiss, took Keri's wine glass and placed it on the windowsill next to his. He turned back to her and said, Surely you must know, Keri, I'm crazy about you. Always have been, always will be. And he kissed her again. Keri pushed him back, but I'm technically still married. Dan shook his head. Don't care. Got my Keri back again, and that's all I care about. Cradling her face in his large, soft hands, he kissed her again. He ran his hand around her neck and under the collar of her blouse. Keri knew where this could lead. She hadn't been properly kissed in years. Every part of her was buzzing with excitement. She made a choice, and closing her eyes, she let their bodies take over. Keri woke in Dan's bed with his body curled around her. She rubbed her head and, grabbing her glasses and her phone from the bedside table, checked the time. Dan kissed her shoulder. Morning, beautiful, he said. Keri put her phone down and turned to face him, their eyes locked. He reached up his hand around her neck and said, "You don't know how many years I've wanted to wake up next to you." Her heart melted as she let his hands explore her body and he pulled himself over her. It was late morning by the time Keri sheepishly arrived back at her mum's. Her mum gave her a semi-stern look and asked, "Nice dinner?" Yes," Keri replied. "I know it's none of my business, but you're not divorced yet. Don't forget this is a village. People see and people talk." Keri reverted to teenager as she said, "Yeah, I know, Mum." "Just saying," her mum challenged back. "Just make sure you know what you're doing." Keri didn't really know what she was doing, but she knew how she was feeling. She was feeling warm, safe and loved. That had to be right, didn't it? Keri showered and spent the afternoon watching Christmas films. Dan had some tractors to fix today, but he said he'd pick her up and take her to the pub later to play pool. And then she didn't know. Soon she would have to be back at work and making some life choices. Just as dusk was starting to fall, there was a knock at the cottage door. Keri's mum went through to answer it. "Oh, hello," she heard her mum say in surprise. "Come on through. She's in here." The living room door opened and in came Matt. His 6-foot frame filled the doorway. His Ken-style hair was messy and askew. Matt's eyes were red with tears and he held a large bouquet of lilies. He sat down next to Keri on the sofa and said, "I really love you. I do. I don't want a divorce. Please don't go." Keri's mum left Keri and Matt to talk in the living room while she was busy in the kitchen. Not her mess, and she wasn't going to sort it. In the living room, Keri's heart was in tatters. She'd married Matt because she loved him, but living with Matt was scary. It was like falling on 1,000 swords every day. He was asking her to try again, to go to counselling, but he'd said that before and didn't go. He said he was sorry and wanted to make it right. What should she do? There was a knock at the door. Keri could hear Dan's voice in the kitchen greeting her mum and her mum saying, "She's through there." Keri cringed as Dan came into the living room. She watched his happy, smiling face drop as he saw Matt with a large bunch of lilies sitting next to Keri on the sofa. Matt looked at Dan and Dan looked at Matt. You could cut the tension with a knife. Instead, the Christmas tree stayed manically flashing in the corner and Keri said nothing. Eventually Dan said, "Hello, Matt." Matt stood as he replied, "Hello." Matt turned to Keri and said, "So you're busy this evening, I take it?" Keri had to make her final choice now, and it would be forever. Both men stood looking at her. Bravely, she stood up and said, "Yeah, I am actually. Dan and I are going to the pub to play pool." Then relenting a little bit, she said, "I'm sorry, Matt. I really am. I will always love you, and I hope you understand. But we tried, and it hasn't worked. I haven't heard from you for days now, because shutting me out is all that you do. I can't live like that anymore. I'm leaving because I want to be happy. I don't want to hurt you. But I choose me." Turning to Dan, she said, "Pub?" Dan tried very hard to hide the wide smile that was plastered across his face as he replied, "Yep," and holding the door open for Keri, he followed her out.